I bought this house to find peace, but I never got to enjoy it alone. My family moved in. Without ever asking. My name is Judith Bishop, and I am 77 years old. When my husband, Robert, passed 5 years ago, I rattled around our old family home like a ghost. It was a mausoleum. Every room was full of his memory, but empty of his life. After 50 years of marriage, the silence you're left with, it's deafening. So I made a decision. I sold that big, empty house. I took the money Robert and I had saved, he an architect, I a university professor, and I bought my sanctuary, a perfect little cottage in the Berkshires overlooking a quiet lake. I dreamed of drinking my morning coffee right here on this porch, listening to nothing but the birds. I had exactly 4 days of that dream. On the 5th day, a minivan pulled up my gravel driveway, my son David and his wife Karen. They said it was a surprise, that they'd come to help me get settled. I never asked for help, and they didn't bring a weekend bag. They brought 6 suitcases, 4 boxes, and their dog. They didn't come to visit. They came to stay. They thought because I was old, I was just grateful for the noise. They thought they were doing me a favor. They were wrong. This is the story of how my golden years turned into a battleground, and how I had to remind my own blood that wisdom isn't the same as weakness. If you've ever felt unseen, I want you to follow my story. Subscribe to my channel, and I'll tell you exactly what happened next. At first, I tried to be a good hostess. It's in my bones. For 50 years, I was the matriarch who hosted Thanksgiving, Christmas, every birthday. I made space, I cooked, I coordinated. I suppose they just assumed I'd keep doing it forever. But hosting is something you offer. It is not something that is taken. Karen started in the kitchen. My beautiful, sun-drenched kitchen. It was the first time in my life I had picked out my own countertops, my own cabinets. Robert and I, we always compromised. This kitchen was just mine. Karen, who hasn't cooked a meal from scratch since I taught her how to make gravy in 1998, took one look around and decided it was all wrong. She patted my hand, that little pat that people give you when they think you're a child, and told me the layout just wasn't functional. By the 2nd day, I couldn't find my tea. She had moved my favorite English breakfast tin from the counter to a top shelf I couldn't reach without a step stool. "It's just clutter, Judy," she'd said, calling me by a name only Robert used to tease me with. When she said it, it sounded like a demotion. My cast-iron skillet, the one I've seasoned for 40 years. She put it under the sink. She said it was unsightly. While Karen was colonizing the kitchen, David annexed my study. That room was the heart of the house for me. It was where I'd put my books, my lifetime of literature. My desk faced the window, looking at the lake. It was my sanctuary. Robert was the architect, but I was the reader. That room was where I was going to write my own story, maybe just in a journal, but it was my space. David decided it was his new home office. He works in, well, I'm still not entirely sure. Something with synergy and leveraging assets. All I know is that the piece I'd paid for was replaced by him shouting, all day long. He'd pace back and forth on my new rug, yelling into his headset about Q4 projections and unacceptable deliverables. He didn't just use the room, he consumed it. The silence I had craved was shattered by a language I didn't understand and a volume I couldn't escape. When I tried to ask him to lower his voice, he'd put his hand up, motioning me to wait, as if I were the interruption. He'd finish his call, pull his headset down, and tell me, "Mom, it's just business. You wouldn't get it." I've held tenure at a major university, David. I understand quite a bit. A week later, the occupation was complete. My grandson, Leo, arrived. 26 years old and looking like he'd just rolled out of a dorm room, which, I suppose, he had. He announced he was between gigs and needed a place to crash. Crashing apparently meant claiming my living room sofa as his permanent residence. He brought with him a video game machine that made sounds of explosions late into the night. And the smell. My new home, which had smelled of fresh paint and old books, now smelled of stale pizza and unwashed socks. He'd leave his empty food containers on my stone fireplace. My beautiful hearth, treated like a trash can. I was becoming a maid in my own retirement. I was washing their dishes, buying their groceries, fetching Karen's functional items from shelves I couldn't reach. The breaking point, the first real crack, came 3 weeks in. I hadn't had a single quiet morning. I hadn't read a full chapter. I was exhausted. I found David on the porch, staring at the lake like he owned it. My voice was shaking a little, but I had to ask. "David," I said, "I'm so glad you could all come and see the new place. But I was wondering what your plans are. When? When are you thinking of heading back?" He looked at me, and he didn't even blink. He put on that face. That smooth, patient face of concern, the one you use on someone who is frail. "Mom," he said, "let's be realistic. You shouldn't be here alone." I must have looked confused, so he continued. "It's just too isolated. We've been talking, Karen and I. We're worried. What if you fall, Mom? What if you have a stroke? Who would know?" It was the most terrifying weapon a child can use against a parent, their love, twisted into a threat. He was using my age, my widowhood, my vulnerability as his reason. Karen joined him then, drawn by the scent of manipulation. She put her arm around my shoulder. "We're just trying to help, Judy," she said. "You don't need to be lonely. We're a family. We're here to take care of you. You're so happy to have us here, aren't you?" It wasn't a question. It was an order. I looked from my son's pitying face to my daughter-in-law's smug one. And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't concern. It wasn't a visit. It was a takeover. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about losing this free ride, this $800 Zordaller's house, paid in full. They thought I was lonely. They mistook my peace for emptiness, and they were counting on my gratitude. They were counting on me being a good, frail old woman who would be so scared of dying alone that I'd let them bury me alive. They had no idea who I was. After that performance on the porch, I retreated. It's an old tactic. When you're a professor and a student is trying to argue their way out of a bad grade with pure bluster, you don't argue back. You get quiet. You let them talk. You listen. They thought my silence was acceptance. They thought they had handled me. David and Karen went back to their lives, satisfied. I made coffee. I smiled when they talked. I faded into the background. It's a skill you learn when you get older. You become invisible. People stop seeing you and start seeing a concept, a sweet old grandmother, a frail widow, a dependent. They were counting on that. They were counting on me being a stereotype. But a professor is always an observer and a mother. A mother knows when her children are lying. This wasn't a spontaneous, "let's help Mom." David had been stressed for months. I'd heard it in his calls. But this was different. This was desperation, not just stress. Why leave their whole city life so fast? Why my house? The answer came in the mail. We have a mailbox at the end of the driveway. It's a lovely little walk, one I used to enjoy in my 4 days of peace. Now Karen insists on getting the mail. She told me she didn't want me tiring myself out. What she meant was she didn't want me seeing what was inside. But people who lie are always sloppy. They underestimate the intelligence of the person they're lying to. She left a stack on the kitchen counter, tucked under a pizza flyer, and my old eyes, the ones they thought were failing, are still sharp. I saw the return address, a large property management group from the city. I waited until they were working, David shouting in my study, Karen curating my living room on her laptop, Leo sleeping until noon. My hand didn't even shake. I opened it. It was a final notice, an eviction, addressed to David and Karen. They were 3 months behind on their rent. They hadn't just decided to visit me. They had been thrown out. My beautiful $800, $1,000 cottage wasn't their vacation spot. It was their lifeboat, and they had no intention of sharing it. They planned to throw the captain overboard. A coldness settled in my chest. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a calculated, desperate invasion. And it meant my son, my only son, had looked me in the eye and lied about being worried for my safety, when all he was worried about was his next mortgage payment, or in this case, his lack of one. The betrayal was so clinical, so total. But I knew it wasn't the whole story. What was the end game? They couldn't just live in my house forever. Could they? I needed to know. That afternoon, I told them I was feeling a bit drained, which, God knows, was the truth, and that I was going to lie down for a nap. This is the other great tool in the arsenal of the old, the nap. It makes you invisible, but it does not make you deaf. My bedroom door was open just a crack. This house, my little cottage, is small. Sound travels. They were in the kitchen, the one Karen had fixed, making coffee. They were talking in those low, excited voices, the kind of voices people use when they think they've already won. I heard Karen's laugh. It was sharp. She was talking about resale value. And then David, my David. He told her that knocking down the wall between the guest room and my study would be easy, that it would create a hell of a master suite for them. He was talking about blueprints. He was talking about it like I was already gone. I held my breath. My hand was on the doorknob. My heart was pounding so hard against my ribs, I thought they would hear it. Then Karen asked the question. Her voice was so practical, like she was discussing paint swatches. She asked, "What about me? What about Mom?" There was a pause. And then my son, the boy whose broken arm I'd set, the man whose college tuition I'd paid. My son said not to worry. He said they could pour a small concrete slab right by the garage. He said they could build a tiny guest cottage for me. A granny pod, he called it. He actually laughed. He told her I wouldn't mind. He told her I'd be happy just to have them close. And then he said the words I will take to my grave. He said, "She's old, Karen. She probably won't even notice the difference." Not notice. Not notice being moved out of the home I had just bought. Not notice being erased from my own life. Not notice being put in a shed. Like an old piece of furniture they didn't have room for anymore. I closed the door, slowly, so it made no sound. The shock was a physical thing. It was like ice water in my veins. It lasted for exactly 10 seconds. And then, something else took its place. It was a feeling I hadn't felt in years. Not since I fought the university board for equal pay in 1978. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't fear. It was clarity. It was the absolute, cold, righteous clarity of a fight you did not start, but you are damn well going to finish. They didn't see a 77-year-old professor of literature. They saw a doddering old fool in a housecoat. They thought I was a problem to be managed. They thought I was finished. I went to the phone by my bed. I thought about calling my old friend Sarah, but no. This was not a time for comfort. This was a time for strategy. I dialed the number for the lawyer who had handled the sale of my old house. Mr. Chen, a sharp man, a man who understood contracts. When he picked up, my voice wasn't the voice of Judy or Mom or Granny. It was the voice of Dr. Bishop. "Mr. Chen," I said, "it's Judith Bishop. I have a complex situation here. I need to know my rights, not as a mother, but as a property owner." My call with Mr. Chen was clarifying. He's a man who deals in facts, not emotions. He told me the law was on my side, but that the process could be unpleasant, especially with family. He asked if I was prepared. I told him I was a 77-year-old woman who had survived 50 years of university faculty meetings. I knew what unpleasant meant. We made a plan. My part for now was simple. Do nothing, gather evidence, and wait. The hardest part was walking out of my bedroom. I had to go from Dr. Judith Bishop an angry woman preparing for war, back to Mom, the sweet fading widow. I've been in amateur theater. In college I played Ophelia badly, but this was the performance of my life. I walked into the kitchen where they were still whispering. I rubbed my eyes. I made myself look smaller, more frail. I asked them what time it was. Karen told me it was almost 4 in the afternoon. She had that pitying look in her eyes, the one that said, "Poor old thing." I pretended to be flustered. I told them I must have been more tired than I thought, that I was getting so forgetful these days. I asked if anyone had seen my favorite mug, the one Karen had hidden on the top shelf. David smiled, a genuine, patronizing smile. He told me not to worry my pretty little head about it. That's what they were there for, he said, to help me. They were so proud of themselves. They had solved their housing crisis and their mom problem all in one. So, I played the part they wrote for me. I became the confused old woman. When Karen asked me what I wanted for dinner, I would seem to drift off, staring out the window, and then ask her to repeat the question. I told her my hearing must be going. When David sat at my dining table, spreading out plans for his office expansion, which I now knew was his future master bedroom, I would sit nearby, looking at a picture book, humming. He'd talk to Karen right in front of me, as if I were a piece of furniture. He'd point to the drawings, talking about load-bearing walls and better flow. He thought I was deaf and blind. I was a sponge. I was a tape recorder. I was noting every word. The real breakthrough, the moment their arrogance truly handed me the knife, happened a few days later. Leo, my grandson, was complaining loudly about the internet speed. He told his parents it was impossible to work in these primitive conditions. His work being, as far as I could tell, shooting aliens on a screen. Karen tried to placate him. She told him to be patient, that they were looking into a long-term solution for the whole property. David shot her a look, a not in front of her look. But Karen was too full of her new role as lady of the manor. She just laughed. She waved her hand toward me where I was sitting on the porch, pretending to do a crossword puzzle. She told David not to be so paranoid. She said that Mom was just happy to have the company, that I didn't care about the logistics. She said I wouldn't know the first thing about zoning permits or variance applications anyway. Zoning permits, variance applications. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just talk anymore. This wasn't a someday plan. They were already moving. They were already checking with the town to see if they could legally build my pod. David, seeing my head perk up, quickly changed the subject. He walked over to me, all smiles. He asked if I needed anything. A shawl, perhaps? He told me it was getting chilly, that I should be careful not to catch a cold. I looked up at him, my son, this stranger who was measuring my property for my own cage. I gave him the most beatific, empty-headed smile I could muster. I told him a shawl would be lovely, dear. They went inside, satisfied. They saw a frail woman who needed a blanket. They had no idea I was an old professor who had just been given the syllabus for their final exam. Their greatest mistake was believing the mask. They thought I was defined by my wrinkles, by my gray hair, by the date on my driver's license. They forgot that the mind doesn't age. It just sharpens. And mine was sharp enough to cut stone. It's a special kind of exhaustion, playing the fool. It wears on you differently than honest work. To smile when you want to scream, to nod when you want to argue, to make yourself small, invisible, so that the people who are trying to erase you forget you're even there. That became my life. I was Judy, the sweet, confused old lady. But Dr. Bishop was very, very busy. My main problem was communication. I couldn't call Mr. Chen from the house. They were always there, always listening, always helping. So I started a new routine. I started taking walks for my health. The first time, David was right at my elbow. He told me I shouldn't go alone, that I might get turned around. His concern was so thick I could have choked on it. I smiled, that vacant smile I was perfecting. I told him the silliest things, that I was just going to look at the pretty rock at the end of the driveway that I remembered Robert and I used to. I'd let my voice trail off, as if I'd forgotten the memory mid-sentence. After a few days, they stopped worrying. They just saw Mom wandering off to be confused by the squirrels. It's amazing how quickly people accept the version of you that is most convenient for them. The minute I was out of sight of the house, my back would straighten. I'd pull out the old-style cell phone I kept in my pocket, the one David called my dinosaur. I'd sit on that rock, the cold seeping through my coat, and I would talk to Mr. Chen. He was all business. He told me their verbal plan to build a granny pod was just talk, but if they had filed for zoning permits or variance applications, as I'd overheard, that was action. That was legal intent. He needed proof. And he needed to know the full financial picture. He asked me very delicately if my son had any access to my accounts. I told him no. I told him I handled my finances. I was a fool. I was the one who was truly confused. The proof I needed came from Karen. She was the weak link. David was cautious, paranoid. He shut his laptop. He locked his door. But Karen was arrogant. She believed her own press. She thought she was the new lady of the manor, and she was already redecorating in her head. She left her laptop open on the kitchen counter. All the time. She'd be scrolling through websites for farmhouse sinks and luxury vinyl plank, and then she'd get up to get more coffee or to tell Leo to turn down his explosions. She left it to go check the mail. I was dozing in the living room, a book open on my chest. I heard the front door click shut. I didn't move for a count of 5. Then I was at that counter. My hands have a tremor these days. It's infuriating. But I didn't let it stop me. I didn't know her password, but the screen was on. It was on a home design website. I didn't need to snoop. The file was right there, on her desktop. It was labeled The Project. I clicked it. It wasn't just ideas. It was a plan. There was a folder for permits, a folder for contractors, and there was the drawing, a sloppy, amateur floor plan of my property. My beautiful cottage was labeled main house. My study was master suite. My bedroom was home office. And there, by the garage, was a small, angry red square. It was labeled JB Cottage. JB, not Mom, not Judith, not grandmother, an initial, a footnote, a problem to be filed away. I should have felt sick. I should have cried. I just felt cold. But that wasn't the worst of it. There was another file in the project folder. It was called Budget. I opened it, my heart. It didn't pound. It just stopped. It wasn't a budget for construction. It was a 5-year financial plan, and the assets weren't theirs. They were mine. It listed my pension, my investment portfolio, the exact to-the-penny balance of my savings account, the remaining money from the sale of my old house. It was all there. And next to these columns of my money were their plans for it. David, new car. Karen, credit card payoff. Leo, fall tuition. They weren't just taking my house. They were draining me. They were planning to bleed me dry. How? How did they know? And then I saw the line item for monthly bank fee, $14.99, and I knew. David. My son, David. After Robert died, he was so helpful. He sat me down at my desk and told me I didn't need to drive to the bank anymore. He told me he could set up all my accounts online. He said it would be easier for me. He held my hand as I typed in a new password, a password he suggested. I thought he was being kind. I thought he was worried about me. He wasn't helping me. He was auditing me. He was counting my money, waiting. He had been watching my accounts for 5 years, watching me like a vulture, just waiting for the moment to strike. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't a temporary setback. This was a long, slow, patient con. I heard the gravel crunch in the driveway. She was coming back. I closed the file. I moved the mouse back to the Farmhouse Sync website. I walked back to my chair. I picked up my book. When Karen walked in, I was exactly where she left me. A confused old woman, dozing in a chair. She looked at me for a long moment. I felt her eyes on me. I'm sure she just saw an old woman, a burden, a problem. She didn't see the truth. She didn't see that I had just become the single most dangerous woman she would ever meet. They hadn't just stolen my peace. They had stolen my name. They had stolen Robert's legacy. And I was going to take it all back. I had the what. The plans for JB Cottage. The budget built from my life savings. I had the how. My son's 5-year digital surveillance of my finances. Now, I needed to act. I needed to cut the wire. Mr. Chen had confirmed it. The bank was the key. As long as David had access, as long as he could see my money, he felt he was in control. He would see any large withdrawals, any transfers to a lawyer. He would shut me down. They were monitoring my digital life, but they had forgotten. I have lived most of my life in the analog world. I needed to get to the bank, in person. How do you get a day pass from your own jailers? You make them think it's their idea. That week, I started a new performance. I began leaving my checkbook out, open, on the coffee table, next to Leo's pizza boxes. I'd sit at the kitchen table, staring at old utility bills, a calculator in my hand, muttering to myself. I was worried about money. I let Karen overhear me on the phone with an old colleague, telling her I was finding it all so complicated since Robert was gone. It took 3 days. I was in the kitchen, pretending to be baffled by a bank statement, when David walked in. He had that look. The predator who smells a wounded animal. He put his hand on my shoulder, all false comfort. He told me I shouldn't be stressing myself out with these things. I looked up at him, my eyes wide with manufactured confusion. I told him I didn't understand where the money was going. I told him I was thinking of moving it. Maybe I should just take it all out, put it under the mattress. I told him I just didn't trust these internet banks. The look on his face. It was a beautiful, terrible mix of panic and greed. Panic that I might do something stupid to his money. Greed that this was his chance to help me consolidate it, to make it even easier for him to control. He told me that was a terrible idea. He told me the bank was the safest place. He told me I just needed to talk to someone. I waited for the beat. He sighed, the long-suffering son. He told me, "All right, Mom, I'll take you." He told Karen to come along, that they would make a day of it and help me sort out my confusion. The next morning, I sat in the back of my car, which David now drove, like a child being taken to the dentist. They were in the front seats, talking about where to go for lunch, as if I weren't there. When we got to the bank, they both got out. They flanked me, walking me inside, 2 dutiful prison guards. I asked for the branch manager, Mrs. Peters. I'd known her for years. We sat outside her office. David tried to come in with me. He told me he could help explain things to her. I turned to him, and for a second I let the mask drop. Just an inch. The voice of Dr. Bishop, not Mom. I told him, "Thank you, David, but I've been managing my own finances for 55 years. I think I can handle this." His eyes widened, just a fraction. He was so startled by the shift in tone, he just stopped. I walked into her office. I closed the door. Mrs. Peters looked at me, her professional smile on. She asked me what she could do for me today, Mrs. Bishop. I sat down. I looked her in the eye. And I told her everything. I told her I was not senile. I told her I was not confused. I told her I was a victim of financial elder abuse perpetrated by my son, who was sitting right outside her door. I was a professor. I know how to present evidence. I didn't cry. I didn't waver. I laid out the facts. the eviction notice, the project file, the online access. She didn't move. She just listened. When I was done, she quietly turned her screen around. She showed me the login history. David had been checking my account every single day, sometimes twice a day. "What would you like to do, Dr. Bishop?" she asked. The doctor was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. I told her. We changed every password. We removed David's name as a secondary contact, a name I never knew he'd added. We created new security questions, ones that had nothing to do with my first pet or mother's maiden name. We set up an alert system that would notify her, the manager, of any unusual activity, not me. And then I asked her for all the activity statements for the last 5 years. Printed. When I walked out of that office 20 minutes later, I was carrying a thick manila envelope and a red lollipop from the bowl on her desk. David and Karen shot up from their chairs. David's eyes went right to the envelope, his face tight with suspicion. I smiled, that same vacant smile. I popped the lollipop into my mouth. I told them Mrs. Peters was a lovely, lovely woman. I told them she explained everything. I told them I was just being a silly old woman and that I felt so much better. David looked, baffled. He couldn't see the statements. He couldn't see the new passwords. All he saw was his confused mother sucking on a piece of candy. He thought he'd won. He thought I'd been calmed down. He had no idea that I had just disarmed him. He had no idea he was now a general with no supply line. He was still logging into my bank account every day. Only now he was looking at a screen that I controlled, a screen that I had just frozen in time. They would find out. Not today, but soon. The first time a transfer didn't go through. The first time their rent check bounced. They had underestimated me. They saw the dinosaur phone, the checkbook, the gray hair. They forgot that dinosaurs. They had teeth. I had cut off their supply line. Now I just had to wait for the siege to work. It's a terrible thing to sit at a dinner table with people you love, or people you used to love, and wait for them to starve. Metaphorically, of course, though, given the way Leo ate, perhaps not. The first week after my trip to the bank was quiet. Too quiet. David was still logging in, but Mrs. Peters had helped me set up a separate, small checking account with a plausible balance. A decoy. The real money, Robert's legacy and my life's work, was now completely walled off, completely invisible to him. He was still checking the old compromised account, but he must have assumed I was just saving or hoarding. The real change happened about 10 days later. The first of the month was approaching. Rent for normal people. Or, in their case, credit card payments and car loans. I was in the kitchen, making my tea with my tea bags that I now kept in my pocket when I heard them. They were in my study, David's office, with the door closed. They weren't shouting. Not at first. It was the kind of arguing, the low, hissing, panicked kind. Karen's voice was sharp. I heard payment returned. I heard unacceptable. David's voice was a low rumble. He told her to keep her voice down. He told her he didn't understand. He told her the account looked fine, but he'd tried to make a transfer, and it just failed. He told her he must have gotten a password wrong. I heard him slam his fist on my desk. My antique desk. The pressure was on. Leo was the next crack to show. He came storming out of the living room, his den of filth, holding his phone. He was yelling, not whispering. He was yelling at David, his father. He told him his card was declined. He told him he couldn't even buy a stupid game. He told David he'd promised. David's face, when he came out of the study, was pale. He was a man watching his con unravel. He looked at Leo, and for a second, I thought he'd confess. But no. He did what weak men always do. He attacked. He told Leo to get a job. Leo, to his credit, looked stunned. He told David that this house, this free ride, was the job. That's what David had told him. The air in my beautiful cottage was thick. It was poisonous. They had come here a united front, a pack of hyenas ready to take down the old lioness. Now, they were turning on each other. Karen wasn't redecorating on her laptop anymore. She was sitting at the kitchen counter, staring at the wall. The farmhouse sink was forgotten. She was looking at Zillow, looking at 2-bedroom apartment rentals. They were getting scared. And scared people make mistakes. They made their biggest one that afternoon. I was on the porch, reading. Actually reading. For the first time in weeks, I was so absorbed in my book that I didn't hear them at first. David and Karen were on the gravel driveway by their minivan. They thought they were out of earshot. They forgot that a 77-year-old woman who lives alone learns to listen to everything. David was desperate. He was telling Karen to stick to the plan. He told her they just had to push it through before she did something crazy with the money. Push what through? He told her he was calling him. He was moving up the consultation. He made the call right there. I watched him. He put on his Synergy voice. He told someone he was Mr. Bishop. He told them he was the owner of the property on Lakeview Drive. He told them he was ready to move forward on the new build. He was impersonating me, or worse, impersonating a non-existent Mr. Bishop, as if I were just a senile dependent. He confirmed the time. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., Mr. Henderson. The contractor. They were going to do it. They were going to sign a contract. They were going to bring a stranger onto my property, lie about who they were, and try to break ground for my prison. They were going to try and put a lien on my house. That was it. That was the moment. I closed my book. I went inside. I went to my bedroom, and I took out the manila envelope Mrs. Peters had given me. The 5 years of bank statements. The proof of his digital spying. I put it on my nightstand, next to the copy of the eviction notice Mr. Chen had couriered to me last week, which I had kept hidden under my mattress. They thought they were bringing a contractor tomorrow. They thought they were finalizing their victory. They had no idea. They hadn't called a builder. They had called a witness. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. They would learn that this old woman wasn't just living in history. She had learned from it. The next morning, I was up before the sun. I made my coffee. I sat on my porch, in my chair, and I watched the fog rise off the lake. It was the last morning I would have to share my peace with my enemies. I dressed carefully, not in a housecoat, not in my old lady clothes. I wore the tweed blazer I used to wear when I was proctoring final exams. I put on the simple pearl earrings Robert had given me for my 40th birthday. I was not Mom. I was not Judy. I was Dr. Judith Bishop, and I was about to hold court. At 9:30, the tension in the house was a living thing. Karen was chain-smoking on the gravel path, a habit I despised. David was pacing in the living room, rehearsing his lies. Leo was, for once, awake, looking confused and sullen, sensing his free ride was about to crash. At 10 a.m., on the dot, a work truck pulled up the driveway. Henderson Construction. David plastered on his salesman's smile. He went outside, his hand outstretched, before the man had even shut off the engine. I waited. I let him start. I heard him through the open window. I heard my son, David, introduce himself. I heard him say he was Mr. Bishop. I heard him tell the contractor that he was the owner and that they were ready to break ground on the new guest cottage. That was my cue. I picked up the manila envelope with the bank statements. I picked up the crisp, folded legal notice from Mr. Chen, and I walked out onto my porch. Mr. Henderson? My voice. It wasn't loud, but it cut right through the morning air. It was my lecture voice, the one that could silence a hall of 300 undergraduates. All 3 men turned. David's face. It froze. The smile was a mask that had just cracked in 2. Mr. Henderson, a broad man with honest eyes, looked confused. He looked from David to me. I walked down the steps, slowly, no tremor in my hands. My name is Dr. Judith Bishop, I said. extending my hand to the contractor. I am the sole legal owner of this property. Mr. Henderson, to his credit, shook my hand. He looked at David, then back at me. Ma'am, I was here to meet Mr. Bishop to discuss the addition. There is no Mr. Bishop here, I said. My eyes locked on David's. My husband, Robert Bishop, passed away 5 years ago. This is my son, David. He is a guest in my home. He has no authority to build, sign, or contract for anything on my land. The silence. It was glorious. Mom, David started. His voice was a strangled whisper. He tried for the old tone, the she's confused tone. Mom, what are you doing? You're confusing Mr. Henderson. I am not confused, David, I said. I held up the manila envelope. I am, however, deeply informed. I turned back to Mr. Henderson. Sir, I must apologize. You have been brought here under false pretenses. My son and his wife, I motioned to Karen, who looked like she'd seen a ghost, are not building a guest cottage. They were planning to build a small shed for me, so they could take over my main house. That's a lie, Karen shrieked, finally finding her voice. Is it? I said, turning to her. Was JB Cottage a lie? Was the project a lie? Was the budget, the one you made using my private financial information, a lie? David went white. He knew. You told me I was confused, David, I said, my voice as cold as the lake. You told me I shouldn't be alone. You told me you were worried. I ripped the flap off the envelope. I didn't take out the statements. I just held them up. You weren't worried. You were watching. You have been spying on my bank accounts for 5 years, David. Ever since your father died. Waiting. You were helping me, all right. Helping yourself to my information. This is, David stammered. This is private. This is family. This, I said, is financial elder abuse. Mr. Henderson took a physical step back. He looked horrified. And you, I said, turning to my son, my voice dropping. You didn't come here to save me. You came here because you were evicted. The final bomb. Leo actually gasped. Karen looked like she was going to be sick. I know you were thrown out of your apartment. I know you had nowhere else to go. You didn't see your mother. You saw a solution, an $800 $100 solution. I let the words hang in the air, and then I held out the other document, the one from Mr. Chen. David, Karen, Leo, this is not a request. David stared at the paper as if it were a snake. That is a formal, legal notice of eviction. You are not tenants. You have no rights here. You are, as of this moment, trespassing. You have 30 days to vacate my property. If you are not gone by then, I will have you removed. The arrogance, the smug, pitying, patronizing superiority. It was gone. All gone. All that was left was the ugly, hollow shock on their faces. They had poked the bear, and they hadn't believed she had claws. I turned back to Mr. Henderson, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. My apologies for your wasted time, sir, I said. As you can see, there will be no construction, of any kind. He just nodded, tipped his hat to me, got in his truck, and drove away. I was left on the gravel driveway with them. 3 people who had just watched their entire future, their entire con, evaporate in the morning sun. After Mr. Henderson's truck disappeared down the drive, there was nothing. Just the ringing silence of a battle won. David stood there, his face pale, the eviction notice fluttering in his hand. Karen was crying, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of rage. Leo just looked, lost, like a child who'd just learned the carnival was closed. Then the venom came. They didn't apologize. They didn't beg. They attacked. Karen was the first. She told me I was a horrible woman, a selfish, unnatural mother. She asked what kind of grandmother would throw her own family out onto the street. David. David was worse. He told me I was old and bitter. He told me I didn't deserve this house all alone while they had nothing. He told me I was just like his father, cold and obsessed with money. He had the nerve to use Robert's name against me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I am not a horrible mother, David, I said, my voice as steady as the oak tree by the porch. I was a good mother. I was such a good mother that you grew up believing you were entitled to the fruits of my labor. You thought you could just inherit my life while I was still living it. I looked at all three of them, this broken, angry little crew. You didn't see a person. You saw a resource. You didn't see a home. You saw an asset. You think I am selfish? I worked for 50 years. I bought this house with my own money. I earned this peace. Respect is not optional. Dignity is not something you get to vote on. I told them the notice said 30 days, but I wanted them out. I was done. They didn't take 30 days. They took 3. It was 3 days of furious, toxic silence. I stayed in my bedroom. I heard them. The slamming of drawers, the stomping on the stairs. They were vindictive. They left trash in the living room. Karen accidentally spilled a bottle of cooking oil all over my new kitchen floor. They were children throwing a tantrum. On the 3rd day, the minivan was loaded. They didn't say goodbye. David just threw the house key, the one I had given him in good faith, onto the gravel driveway. He didn't even look at me. He just got in the car and drove away. I watched them go. I felt not sadness, not joy, just quiet. The first thing I did was call a locksmith. As I heard the click of the new deadbolt, I felt my shoulders drop for the first time in a month. The second thing I did was call Mr. Chen. I told him the occupants were gone, and then I told him I needed to make one final, permanent change. I was changing my will. David was no longer my heir. My house, my beautiful sanctuary, will not go to the son who tried to put me in a shed. It will go to the university where I taught. It will fund a scholarship for young women who want to study literature. My legacy won't be a granny pod. It will be a library. After that, I cleaned. I scrubbed my kitchen floor. I threw out Leo's pizza boxes and the cheap beer he left in my fridge. I went into my study, David's office, and I opened the window. I let the fresh, cold air chase out the stale smell of his greed. I put my books back on the shelves. I put my teacup back on the counter. And now, I am here. It's morning again. I'm on my porch. The coffee is hot. The lake is still. The silence is glorious. It's not the empty, deafening silence of a mausoleum. It's not the lonely silence they were so afraid of on my behalf. It's the sound of my own life. It's the sound of peace, earned and reclaimed. They thought the worst part of getting old was the loneliness. They were wrong. The worst part is having to fight your own children for the right to exist. The hardest part is having to teach your own family that a 77-year-old woman is not a child. And she is certainly not a fool. This story, my story, I wanted to share it because I know I'm not the alone. I know there are people out there, in all corners of the world, who have been made to feel invisible, who have been underestimated because of the gray in their hair or the date on their driver's license. I'd love to know where you're watching from. If my story touched you, please drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this message of strength can travel, and if you want to hear more, because believe me, every grandmother has a tale that needs to be told. Please subscribe to my channel. Let's show them we still have a voice.